to another edition of Ralph and Robert's Reading Railroad.
Chapter 5. The Hunt is Intensified. "Hey!" Oscar Smuff shouted. "You be careful with that penknife. The man who owns this place don't want you ruining his cars." Frank Hardy looked up at the detective. "I've watched my father scrape off flecks of paint many times. The way he does it, you wouldn't know anybody had made a mark." Smuff grunted. "But you're not your father. Easy there." As cautiously as possible, Frank picked off flecks of the red paint in a spot where it would hardly be noticeable. Taking a flashlight from his pocket, he trained it on the spot. Joe, leaning over his brother's shoulder, said, "There was light blue paint under this red, not yellow." "Right," Frank agreed, eyeing Smuff intently. The detective reddened. "You fellows trying to tell me this isn't Chet's jalopy?" he demanded. "Well, I'm telling you it is, and I'm right." "Oh, we haven't said you're wrong," Joe spoke up quickly. Secretly, he was hoping that this was Chet's car, but reason told him it was not. "We'll try another place," Frank said, straightening up, and walked around to a fender on the opposite side. Here, too, the test indicated that the car had been painted light blue before the red coat had been put over it. "Well, maybe the thief put blue on, then red," said Smuff stubbornly. Frank grinned. "We'll go a little deeper. If the owner of this establishment objects, we'll pay for having the fenders painted." But though Frank went down through several layers of paint, he could not find any sign of yellow. All this time, Chet had been walking around and around the car, looking intently at it inside and out. Even before Frank announced that he was sure this was not the missing jalopy, Chet was convinced of it himself. "The Queen had a long, thin dent in the right rear fender," he said, "and the seat cushion by the door had a little split in it. I don't think the thief would have bothered to fix them up." Chet showed his keen disappointment, but he was glad that the Hardys had come along to help him prove the truth. But Smuff was not giving up that easily. "You haven't proved a thing," he said. "The man who run this place admitted that maybe this is a stolen car. The fellow who sold it to him said he lived on a farm outside Bayport." The Hardys and Chet were taken aback for a moment by this information, but in a moment Frank said, "Let's go talk to the owner. We'll find out more about the person who brought this car in." The man who ran the used car lot was very cooperative. He readily answered all questions the Hardys put to him. The bill of sale revealed that the former owner of the red jalopy was Melvin Schuster of Bayport. "Why, we know him," Frank spoke up. "He goes to Bayport High. At least, he did. He and his family moved far away. That's probably why he sold his car." "But Mr. Smuff said you suspected the car was stolen," Joe put in. The used car lot owner smiled. "I'm afraid maybe Mr. Smuff put that idea in my head. I did say that the person seemed in an awful hurry to get rid of the car and sold it very cheap. Sometimes when that happens, we dealers are a little afraid to take the responsibility of buying a car in case it is stolen property. But at the time Mr. Schuster came in, I thought everything was on the level and bought his jalopy." Frank said that he was sure everything was all right, and after the dealer described Melvin Schuster, there was no question but that he was the owner. Smuff was completely crestfallen. Without a word, he started for his own car, and the boys followed. The detective did not talk on the way back to the Morton farm, and the boys, feeling rather sorry for him, spoke of matters other than the car incident. As the Hardys and Chet walked into the Morton home, The two girls rushed forward. Did you find it? Find it? Iola asked eagerly. Chet sighed. Another one of Smuff's bluffs, he said disgustedly. He handed back the money which his friends had given to help pay the detective. Frank and Joe said goodbye and went for their motorcycles, took Allie home. Then they returned to their own house, showered, and went to bed. As soon as school was over the next day, they took the gray wig and visited Schwartz's shop. The owner assured them that the hairpiece had not come from his store. It's a very cheap one, the man said rather disdainfully. Frank and Joe visited Flint's and Reuben Brothers' shops as well. Neither place had sold the gray wig. Furthermore, neither of them had had a customer in many weeks who had wanted a red wig or who was in the habit of using wigs or toupees of various colors. Today's sleuthing was a complete washout, Joe reported that night to his father. The famous detective smiled. Don't be discouraged. I can tell you that one bit of success makes up for 100 false trails. As the boys were undressing for bed later, Frank reminded his brother that the following day was a school holiday. That'll give us hours and hours to work on the case, he said enthusiastically. What do you suggest we do? Joe asked. Frank shrugged. Several ideas were brought up by the brothers, but one which Joe proposed was given preference. They would get a hold of a large group of their friends, on the theory that the thief could not have driven a long distance away, and because of the police alarm, the boys would make an extensive search in the surrounding area for Chet's jalopy. We'll hunt at every possible hiding place, he stated. Early the next morning, Frank hurried to the telephone and put in one call after another to the gang. These included, besides Chet Morton, Alan Hooper, nicknamed Biff because of his fondness for a distant relative who was a boxer named Biff, Jerry Gilroy, Phil Cohen, Tony Preto. All were students at Bayport High and prominent in various sports. The five boys were eager to cooperate. They agreed to assemble at the Hardy home at 9 o'clock. In the meantime, Frank and Joe would lay out a plan of action. As soon as breakfast was over, the Hardys told their father what they had in mind and asked if he had any suggestions on how they might go about their search. Take a map, he said, with our house as a radius, and cut pie-shaped sections. I suggest two boys work together. By 9 o'clock, his sons had mapped out the search in detail. The first recruit to arrive was Tony Preto, a lively boy with a good sense of humor. He was followed in a moment by Phil Cohen, a quiet, intelligent boy. Put us to work, said Tony. I brought one of my father's trucks that he isn't going to use today. Tony's father was in the contracting business. I can cover a lot of miles in it. Frank suggested that Tony and Phil work together. He showed them the map with Bayport as the center of a great circle cut into 4 equal sections. Suppose you take from 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock on this dial we've marked. Mother has agreed to stay at home all day and act as clearinghouse for our reports. Call in every hour. Will do, Tony promised. Come on, Phil, let's get going. The two boys were just starting off when Biff and Jerry arrived at the Hardy home on motorcycles. Biff, blond and long-legged, had an ambling gait with which he could cover a tremendous amount of territory in a short time. Jerry, an excellent fielder on Bayport High's baseball team, was of medium height, wiry, and strong. Biff and Jerry were assigned to the section on the map designated 6 to 9 o'clock. They were given further instructions on sleuthing and then started off on their quest. Where's Chet? Mr. Hardy asked his sons. Wasn't he going to help in the search? He probably overslept. Chet's been known to do that, Frank said with a grin. He also might have taken time for a double breakfast, Joe suggested. Mrs. Hardy, who had stepped onto the front porch, called, "Here he comes now. Is that Mr. Morton's car?" "Yes, it is," Frank replied. Chet's father led him off in front of the Hardy home, and the stout boy hurried to the porch. "Good morning, Mrs. Hardy." "Good morning, Mr. Hardy. Hi, chums," he said cheerily. "Sorry to be late. My dad had a lot of phoning to do before he left. I was afraid if I tried to walk here, I wouldn't have arrived until tomorrow." At this point, Mr. Hardy spoke up. "As I said before, I think you boys should work in twos. There are only three of you to cover half the territory." The detective suddenly grinned boyishly. "How about me teaming up with one of you?" Frank and Joe looked at their dad in delight. "You mean it?" Frank cried out. "I'll choose you as my partner right now." "I have a further suggestion," the detective said. "It's not going to take you fellows more than 3 hours to cover the area you've laid out. And there's an additional section I think you might look into." "What's that?" Joe inquired. "Willow Grove. That's a park area, but there's a lot of tangled woodland to one side of it. Good place to hide a stolen car." Mr. Hardy suggested that the boys meet for a picnic lunch at Willow Grove and later do some sleuthing in the vicinity. That is, provided you haven't found Chick's jalopy by that time. Mrs. Hardy spoke up. "I'll fix a nice lunch for all of you," she offered. "That sure would be swell." "Oh," Chet said hastily, "you make great picnic lunches, Mrs. Hardy." Frank and Joe liked the plan, and it was decided that the boys would have the picnic whether or not they found the jalopy by 1 o'clock. Mrs. Hardy said she would relay the news to the other boys when they phoned in. Chet and Joe set off on the Hardy boys' motorcycles, taking the 12 to 3 segment on the map. Then Mr. Hardy and Frank drove off for the 3 to 6 area. Hour after hour went by, with the searchers constantly on the alert. Every garage, public and private, every used road, every patch of woods was thoroughly investigated. There was no sign of Chet's missing yellow jalopy. Finally, at 1 o'clock, Frank and his father returned to the Hardy home. A few moments later, Joe and Jet returned, and a huge picnic lunch was stowed aboard the 2 motorcycles. When the 3 boys reached the picnic area, they were required to park their motorcycles outside the fence. They unstrapped the lunch baskets and carried them down to the lakefront. The other boys were already there. "Too bad we can't go swimming," Tony remarked, "but this water's pretty cold." Quickly they unpacked the food and assembled around one of the park picnic tables. "Yum, yum, chicken sandwiches," Chick cried gleefully. During the meal, the boys exchanged reports on their morning sleuth. All had tried hard but failed to find any trace of the missing car. "Our work hasn't ended," Frank reminded the others, "but I'm so stuffed I'm going to rest a while before I start out again." All the other boys but Joe Hardy felt the same way and lay down on the grass for a nap. Joe, eager to find out whether or not the woods to their right held the secret of the missing car, plunged off alone through the underbrush. He searched for about 20 minutes without finding a clue to any automobile, and he was on the point of returning and waiting for the other boys when he saw a small clearing ahead of him, and it appeared to be part of an abandoned roadway. Excitedly, Joe pushed on through the dense undergrowth. It was in a low-lying part of the grove, and the ground around was wet. At one point, it was quite muddy, and it was here that Joe saw something that aroused his curiosity. A tire! Then, maybe an automobile had been in here, he muttered to himself, although there were no tire marks in the immediate vicinity. No footprints either. I guess someone tossed this tire here. Remembering his father's admonition on the value of developing one's powers of observation, Joe went closer and examined the tie. That tread, he thought excited, looks familiar. He gazed at it until he was sure, then dashed back to the other boys. I found a clue, he cried out. Come on, everybody. Chapter 6 The Robbery. Joe Hardy quickly led the way into the swampy area as the other boys trooped along, everyone talking at once. When they reached the spot, Chet examined the tire and exclaimed, There's no mistake about it. This is one of the tires. When the thief put on the new one, he threw this away. Perhaps the queen is still around, suggested Frank quickly. The thief may have picked this road as a good place to hide your jalopy until he could make a getaway. It would be an ideal place, Chet agreed. People coming to Willow Grove have to park at the gate, so no one would come in here. But this old road comes in from the main highway. Let's take a look, fellows. A scrutinizing search was begun along the abandoned road, in the direction of the highway. A moment later, Frank and Chet in the lead cried out simultaneously, Here's a bypath, and here are tire marks, Frank exclaimed to him. To one side was a narrow roadway, almost overgrown with weeds and low bushes. It led from the abandoned road into the depths of the woods. Without hesitation, Frank and Chet plunged into it. Presently, the roadway widened out, then wound around a heavy clump of trees. It came into an end in a wide clearing, and in the clearing stood Chet Morton's lost jalopy. My queen, he yelled in delight. Her old license plates. His shout was heard by the rest of the boys who came on a run. Chet's joy was boundless. He examined the car with minute care while his chums crowded around. At last he straightened up with a smile of satisfaction. She hasn't been damaged a bit. All ready to run. The thief just hit the old bus in here and made a getaway. Come on, fellows, climb aboard. Free ride to the highway. Before leaving, the Hardys examined footprints left by the thief. He wore sneakers, Frank observed. Suddenly, Chet swung open the door and looked on the floor. You mean he wore my sneakers? They're gone. Carry his own shoes, Joe observed. Very clever. Well, this washes out one clue. Can't trace the man by his shoe prints. Let's go, Chet urged. Jumped into the car, and in a few seconds the engine roared. There was barely sufficient room in the clearing to permit him to turn the jalopy about. When he swung around and headed up the bypath, the boys gave a cheer and hastened to clamber aboard. Lurching and swaying, the car reached the abandoned road, and from there made the run to the main highway. The boys transferred to Tony's truck, and the motorcycles formed a parade into Bayport, with Frank and Joe in the lead. It was their intention to ride up to police headquarters and to announce their success to Chief Cawley. And I hope Smuff will be around, Chet gloated. As the grinning riders came down Main Street, however, they noticed that no one paid any attention to them, and there seemed to be an unusual air of mystery in the town. People were standing in little groups, gesticulating and talking earnestly. Presently, the Hardys saw Oscar Smuff striding along with a portentous frown. Joe called out to him, What's going on, detective? You notice we found Chet's car? I got something more important than stolen cars to worry about. Hey, what's that? Detective Smuff. stared blankly as the full import of the discovery filtered his consciousness. The boys waited for Smuff's praise, but when he did not give it, instead, he said, I got a big mystery to solve. Tower Mansion has been robbed. Oh, good night, the Hardys chorused. Tower Mansion was one of the showplaces of Bayport. Few people lived in the city had ever been permitted to enter the place, and the admiration which the palace building excited was solely by reason of exterior appearance. But the first thing a newcomer to Bayport usually asked was, who owns that house with the towers over on the hill? It was an immense rambling stone structure, overlooking the bay, and could be seen for miles, silhouetted against the skyline like an ancient feudal castle. The resemblance to a castle was heightened by the fact that from each of the far ends of the mansion arose a high tower. One of these had been built when the mansion was erected by Major Applegate, an eccentric, retired old army man who had made a fortune by lucky real estate deals. Years ago, there had been many parties and dances in the mansion, but the Applegate family had become scattered, until at last there remained in the old home only Herd Applegate and his sister Adela. They lived in the vast, lonely mansion at the present time. Herd Applegate was a man about 60, tall and stooped. His life seemed to be devoted now to the collection of rare stamps. But a few years before, he had built a new tower onto the mansion, a duplicate of the original. His sister Adela was a maiden lady of uncertain years. Well-dressed women in Bayport were amused by her clothes. She dressed in clashing colors and unbecoming styles. Herd and Adela Applegate were reputed to be enormously wealthy, although they lived simply, kept only a few servants, and never had visitors. Tell us about the theft, Joe begged Smuff, but the detective waved his hand down. You'll have to find out yourselves, he retorted as he hurried off. Frank and Joe called goodbye to their friends and headed for home. As they arrived, the boys saw Herd Applegate just leaving the house. The man tapped the steps with his cane as he came down them. When he heard the boys' motorcycle, he gave them a piercing glance. Good day, he growled in a grudging manner and went on his way. He must have been asking Dad to take the case, Frank said to his brother as they pulled into the garage. The boys rushed into the house, eager to find out more about the robbery. In the front hallway, they met their father. We heard the Tower Mansion has been robbed, said Joe. Mr. Hardy nodded. Yes, Mr. Applegate was just here to tell me about it. He wants me to handle the case. How much was taken? Mr. Hardy smiled. Well, I don't suppose it will do any harm to tell you. A safe in the Applegate Library was opened. The loss will be about $40,000, all in securities and jewels. Phew! Frank exclaimed. What a haul! And when did it happen? Either last night or this morning. Mr. Applegate did not get up until after 10 o'clock this morning and did not go into the library until nearly noon. It was then that he discovered the theft. How was the safe opened? By using the combination. It was opened either by someone who knew the set of numbers or else by a very clever thief who could detect the noise of the tumblers. I'm going up to the house in a few minutes. Mr. Applegate is to call for me. I'd like to go along, Joe said eagerly. So would I, Frank declared. Mr. Hardy looked at his sons and smiled. Well, if you want to be detectives, I suppose it is about as good a chance as any to watch a crime investigation from the inside. If Mr. Applegate doesn't object, you may come with me. A few minutes later, a foreign make chauffeur driven car drew up before the Hardy home. Mr. Applegate was seated in the rear, his chin resting on his cane. The three Hardys went outside. When the detective mentioned the boy's request, the man merely grunted assent, and moved over. Frank and Joe stepped in after their father. The car headed toward Tower Mansion. I really don't need a detective in this case, Herb Applegate snapped. No need one at all. It's as clear as the nose on your face. I know who took the stuff, but I can't prove it. Whom do you suspect? Fenton Hardy asked. Only one man in the world could have taken the jewels and securities. Robinson. Robinson? Yes, Henry Robinson, the caretaker. He's the man. The Hardy boys looked at each other in consternation. Henry Robinson, the caretaker of the Tower Mansion, was the father of one of their closest chums. Perry Robinson, nicknamed Slim, was the son of the accused man. That his father should be blamed for the robbery seemed absurd to the Hardy boys. They had met Mr. Robinson upon several occasions, and he appeared to be a good natured, easy-going man with high principles. I don't believe he's guilty, Frank whispered. Neither do I, returned his brother. What makes you suspect Robinson? Mr. Hardy asked Herb Applegate. Well, he's the only person beside my sister and me who ever saw the safe opened and closed. He could have learnt the combination if he kept his eyes and ears open, which I'm sure he did. Is this your only reason for suspecting him? No, this morning he paid off a $900 note at the bank. And I know for a fact he didn't have more than $100 to his name a few days ago. Now, where did he raise $900 so suddenly? Perhaps he has a good explanation, Mr. Hardy suggested. Oh, he'll have an explanation, all right, sniffed Mr. Applegate. But it'll have to be a mighty good one to satisfy me. The automobile was speeding up the wide driveway that led to Tower Mansion, and within a few minutes it stopped at the front entrance. Mr. Hardy and the two boys accompanied the eccentric man into the house. Nothing has been disturbed in the library since the discovery of the theft, he said, leading the way there. Mr. Hardy examined the open safe, then took out a special magnifying glass from his pocket. With minute care, he inspected the dial of the combination lock. Next, he walked to each window and the door to examine them for fingerprints. He asked Mr. Applegate to hold his fingers up to a strong light and to get a clear view of the whorls and lines on the inside of the tips. At last he shook his head. A smooth job, he observed. The thief must have worn gloves. All the fingerprints in the room, Mr. Applegate, seem to be yours. No use for looking for fingerprints or any other evidence, Mr. Hardy barked impatiently. It was Robinson, I tell you. Perhaps it would be a good idea for me to ask him a few questions, Mr. Hardy advised. Mr. Applegate rang for one of the servants and instructed him to tell the caretaker to come to the library at once. Mr. Hardy glanced at the boys and suggested they wait in the hallway. It might prove less embarrassing to Mr. Robinson that way, he said in a low voice. Frank and Joe readily withdrew. In the hall, they met Mr. Robinson and his son Perry. The man was calm but pale, and at the doorway he patted Slim on the shoulder. Don't worry, he said. Everything will be all right. With that, he entered the library. Slim turned to his two friends. It's gotta be, he cried out. My dad is innocent.
No part of this episode may be reproduced without my personal permission. Railfan Roberts Reading Railroad is a production of Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Productions. And all podcast episodes are owned by Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Production.